3. Edge of Darkness. Harry Truman stared into the bathroom mirror, hating his reflection. The face that stared back was a patchwork mass of scar tissue and deformity. The face that he had been born with had burned away a long time ago. Truman spent hours searching his reflection for an echo of his lost features. He found none. He hated the thing in the mirror. He wasn't alone. Most others who had seen it found it repugnant. But Truman's hate was deepest. He couldn't have lived with one deformity. Here was an army of them. Scabbed, swollen remnants of the original flesh hung loose on the bone. Wheels lacerated it, torn out of the face like a freshly ploughed landscape. Occasional flashes of smooth bone jutted through the skin. His eyes bulged out from their hollow, fleshless sockets. Everything he had feared, every deformity, every nightmare, had been visited on his face. His new features taunted him by adopting the inflections of his once handsome visage. Truman hated it because it was him. The deformities were broken by jigsaw patches of smooth, blotchy skin grafts. Plastic surgery had been a mistake, an expensive mistake. At the time, it seemed to make sense. Truman was no longer able to concentrate. His new face distracted him. He would spend hours tracing the lines of his features in preference to work. He missed the old familiarity. None of his colleagues or his friends had been comfortable around someone who had to hide behind a mask. Surgery seemed a promising option, but Truman already had an abundance of flesh, and adding more only made things worse. The surgeons were deranged chefs, slapping on more layers onto an already rickety and overworked cake. It hadn't improved his appearance. It made him poor and disillusioned. Truman stopped caring then. He walked out of his life, giving up everything. His old life was gone. He had spent a year shedding memories and friends. A half-remembered year of homeless wandering when the scope of his ambition contracted to bare existence. A year of hiding in hostels. A year that wiped away his past. The name of his company was gone. Memories of friends, enemies, neighbours and lovers were reduced to a gallery of meaningless faces and idiosyncrasies. His life became a blur of empty remembrance. Even the circumstances of his accident were forgotten. Only his name and a handful of memories survived. And his face. Always his face. It had taken a year before he found anything new. He came to the house out of desperation, drawn by a vague hope of manual work. He found himself with a permanent position in a home that offered stability and isolation. He found himself employed by people whose loyalty, respect and friendship were quickly forthcoming. He wore a mask in their company, but they had a fair idea of what it hid, and they didn't mind. Truman found a niche and a purpose. He still hated his face, but it didn't seem to matter anymore. "Monster," he told his reflection. It smiled bitterly at him. Reluctantly, he replaced his mask. It always took longer than he expected. He had to make sure that it was placed correctly and tight. He had nightmares of it coming off at an awkward moment. The mask was a simple wooden plate, smoothed into expressionlessness. It covered Truman's face from his hair to below his chin, incorporating an elaborate mouthpiece which could be removed so that he could eat in public. Tear-shaped holes were cut halfway up the wood, while a slot was dug over his mouth, enough to see and talk. It was a well-ventilated item, cushioned, comfortable. It had been made for him after the accident, one of the few things he had never thrown away. He hated it. The mask made him faceless. It had no features beyond the slight curve in the mouth slot, forming an inane smile. It was a grotesquely bland thing, like the theatrical masks of comedy and tragedy. Truman's mask grinned. It stole his self-expression, a blessing sometimes. Mostly he found it isolating. No one saw deeper than the vacant grin, the real Harry Truman. The mask made him more of a freak than the twisted mess it hid. Truman scowled at his reflection. It grinned back at him. "Bastard," he said. The mask, its mouth fixed, said nothing. The bathroom door opened behind him. Dry hinges groaned with the effort of movement. Truman didn't bother turning. He already saw the newcomer framed in the doorway in the mirror. The woman's features swam on the surface of the glass. A soft face surrounded by a stream of loose hair. Her eyes were inquisitive and dull simultaneously. Her name was Sandra. She had been part of Truman's life for 2 years. She stared at Truman's back, smiling uneasily. "Harry?" she said slowly, almost as if she were framing a question. Truman nodded, then added a soft, "Yes." He turned nervously, straightening his tie. Instinctively, one hand leapt to check that his mask straps were still tight. He smiled widely at her, blissfully aware that she couldn't see it. Sandra was one of his employers, his friend. With little age difference between them, and no one else in the house of remotely similar age capable of holding a sensible conversation, they had been drawn naturally together. They respected and liked each other, shared loyalties and confidences. Truman had come to realize that he wanted more. Something more special, deeper, more intimate. Something, and he admitted this grudgingly, more physical. He had admitted none of this to Sandra, certain though he was that she suspected. He was sure that she wouldn't agree, that even the slightest inference might spoil the friendship they shared. Truman's eyes didn't stray from her. There was little else in the bathroom worth watching. It was a soulless place, its sterility sharpened by the pervasive smell of disinfectant and the persistently crooked mirror. There was nothing in the room that was not purely functional. Sandra's presence breathed life into the room. The lights came on. They were an old system of fluorescent tubes which took several attempts to kick into life. They would flicker wildly. On special occasions they strobed. This time the light was harsh and steady. It flooded the room, and Truman got a clear glimpse of his closest friend. She was smiling dreamily and looking straight at him. Her eyes weren't properly focused. They never seemed to settle for more than a few seconds, one of her most attractive, irritating mannerisms. She was simply dressed, a bland contrast to the features which Truman adored. Jeans and a sweater, an unexciting combination rendered interesting only by the shape of the body around which they moulded. "Shower?" he asked. Sandra mouthed yes. Instantly, unbidden, a picture of the showering Sandra leapt before Truman's eyes. The beautiful, perfect image smiled coyly, then vanished. Truman shuddered, blinked, and forgot. "Ah, I'm just leaving. Don't let me hurry you if you're not done." Sandra's mouth formed a sympathetic smile. She stepped to one side, blocking Truman's exit. "I've got all the time in the world." Truman stopped sharply, wondering if she registered his unease. She probably couldn't avoid it. It was written over his stupid. Truman relaxed, his confidence returning to him, his eyes locking onto Sandra's warm features. "Have you talked to Justin?" Sandra asked, eyebrows arching. Truman shook his head. "He won't let me near him," he said, picking his words carefully. "He sits in the corner and waves fruit at me." Sandra looked away suddenly. Truman trailed off. "He's not getting better, is he?" "Not much, no." She was dismissive. Her back was turned to Truman. Whether she was deliberately avoiding his gaze, he couldn't tell. "He doesn't talk anymore, he rambles. He's as coherent as a 3-year-old, and as predictable. He talks about you a lot. He's very possessive." "I'm sorry," said Truman. She didn't seem to hear. "The rest of the time he's worse." Her voice sank into a dull whisper. "It's him. It's the real him. I know it is. But it's only the worst parts of him. He hates everyone. Hates Dad, this house, himself, you, me." "He doesn't hate you." Secretly, Truman hoped otherwise. "He does. A part of him does. He still wants me, for all the wrong reasons. He's quite gentle at times, but that's all. He's regressed to the state he was in 6 months ago. One part of him just wants to use me, and the other's a toddler who'll go to pieces without me. 6 months' work, bang, gone in 5 minutes. She slumped on the chair in the corner, shooting Truman a glance packed with pain and suppressed resentment. Her shoulders sank forward, and her fringe fell over her face, obscuring her eyes. Truman felt she was crying. He wanted to try and comfort her, but he knew Sandra well enough to check himself. This was anger. Some frustration, mostly anger. "I'm sorry," he said again. "It's not your fault," Sandra growled through clenched teeth. "It could have been you in there. It's his fault for wanting to go alone in the first place." She broke off suddenly. Angry eyes concentrated on Truman. "You want him to go in again." Her voice was hushed and powerful. "You're scared of going in alone, and you want him to go with you. You want to know if he's up to it." "No," Truman snapped truthfully, preparing to go on the defensive. But Sandra was already shaking her head. "I'm sorry. It's just so bloody frustrating. Everything I've built in the last 6 months has just turned into shit. It's going to take years to get him back to normal. Just when I thought I could let him go, this." She slumped, not speaking for almost a minute. "When do you take the plunge?" "In about 5 minutes," Truman said, without confidence, though he was heartened by Sandra's look of apologetic shock. "I want to get something on tape for your father. He's desperate to try it himself. It was all I could do to talk him out of it." Sandra nodded. "It'll probably kill him," she agreed. "Look at Justin." She checked herself, adding, "I'm not building your confidence, am I?" Truman tapped the side of his mask and smiled ruefully. "It can't do anything to me that hasn't been done already." Sandra smiled and rose from her chair. Her lips pressed briefly against his mouth slot. Beneath the mask, Truman flushed. "Good luck." "Thank you," Truman replied stiltedly, before scuttling out of the door. It closed behind him. He stood waiting on the landing, his eyes closed. The image he'd seen before flickered under his eyelids. The hateful, enthralling picture of Sandra, smooth, soaking, and perfectly naked, slowly in monochrome, like a jammed projector playing an endless loop of old film. It was a thrilling image, ultimately unreal, but so vivid, like a fragment of an old memory plucked from his subconscious. That was impossible. The woman in the shower was Sandra, a good 5 years younger than she was now. It could only be a confused memory, mixing his past reality with his present fantasy. It wasn't until he was disturbed by the sound of a key turning in a lock that he turned away. He did have a job to do. When leaving the TARDIS, Ace always had the feeling of stepping from one world to another. The disconcerting realization that the enormous complex machine she had left shrank to the shape of a police box on the outside, a police box in the weirdest surroundings. The TARDIS had materialized with unusual smoothness. The light at the heart of the console waned and snuffed itself out. The room filled with darkness again, and the console remained dormant. The doors had hummed with life, swinging open of their own accord. Faced with little choice, they had left. Outside the TARDIS, it was dark. The air was heavy, thick with the stuffiness of an undisturbed room. Brick rose in the darkness in all directions, picked out by the beam of Ace's torch. Instinctively, she felt they were underground. She associated the claustrophobic sense of pressure with depths. She'd once spent 3 weeks in a disused mine on a nameless alien world, alone with a small, tense squad of corporate mercenaries. She'd felt the same sense of confinement there. She hadn't forgotten it. They were apparently alone. Ace was sceptical. She emerged from the TARDIS, tensed for a fight. There could be anything waiting to meet them, and, though their surroundings seemed deserted, she pressed up against the side of the police box before taking a look round. Her torch picked out crumbling brickwork or loose wooden partition structures where walls should be. Shining the beam at the ceiling, she saw that it was supported by an undisguised network of wooden beams. The whole thing looked fragile. Thick, ancient cobwebs were strung between the beams, probably all that was holding the ceiling together. Ace lowered the torch slowly, catching a snatch of Benny's back on its way down. Less cautious than Ace, she was already over by one of the walls studying the brickwork. Ace ignored her and swung the light to the floor. The floor was a minefield of strewn wooden beams and crumbling blocks piled on plain boards. All were covered by a carpet of dust. Ace cast the beam further round the room, picking out more interesting hazards: chunks of plaster, large shards of broken glass, abandoned ornaments. The light brushed over the shattered features of a human face, and Ace tensed before discovering that it was a plaster bust, one side smashed in. Just more rubbish. The room was a store for anything that someone at one time had decided to dispose of. Ace relaxed. There was no sign of anything immediately threatening. A dark shape moved clumsily round the side of the TARDIS, but this was only the Doctor, locking the TARDIS door. He moved slowly and unsteadily, like a troubled man. "There's no point in doing that," Ace pointed out. "If they can control the TARDIS, they can get the door open." "True," the Doctor mumbled, shoving the door to ensure it was locked. "But it should make it a little more difficult. Besides, we don't know who else is out there." Typically, he seemed entirely unaffected by the events of the last half hour. He looked healthier than ever, almost refreshed. "Anyway," he announced, "until we find whatever's brought us here, the TARDIS is out of bounds." "What?" Ace exploded. "All my bloody gear's in there." "Gear?" The Doctor looked at her suspiciously. "Weapons, explosives, heavy technology." Ace rattled off the list of her prized possessions, all the things which the Doctor disapproved of. Long-standing experience suggested that he wasn't going to be swayed. She stopped talking and swore inwardly. "My diary," Benny said. "I left it in my room." She stared imploringly at the Doctor, but he adopted a grainy expression and shook his head. Benny sighed slowly, gesturing around the room. "Do you have any idea where we are?" she asked. "Somewhere unpleasant, am I right?" "Earth," the Doctor replied without elaboration. "Couldn't you be more specific?" asked Ace, beating Benny to the question by a second. "Not really. We're probably somewhere in the northern hemisphere. We're underground." Ace smiled to herself as he spoke. "In the cellar of some sort of structure. A large house, a hotel, possibly a warehouse." Ace hugged herself. Derelict houses formed part of a vivid childhood nightmare. She'd grown much since then, but there was still a kernel of disquiet buried in her subconscious. There was something here, an echo of that experience. She shivered, then scowled, hating her obvious weakness. "What about the date?" she asked. "I couldn't tell you." 20th century, Ace prompted. It was an informed guess. The TARDIS had a knack of gravitating to that period. She'd asked the Doctor about it once, and he'd summed it up as familiarity. "Possibly. Somewhere unpleasant," Benny added cheerily. "I can't tell you," the Doctor shrugged. "Something's interfering with the TARDIS computer systems." He paused briefly. "First, there is a mountain. Then there is no mountain. Then there is." "The easy ones first, eh?" Benny responded. "I should have guessed." "I'm going to see if there's a way out," he said distractedly. 5 minutes. Don't go wandering off on your own. Or together, for that matter." Without waiting for an answer, he slipped into the darkness. Benny rubbed her temples in a weary, soothing motion. Ace grinned and leaned back against the nearest wall. The brickwork felt alarmingly soft against her shoulder blades. Bernice joined her by the wall, running a finger down its length. Ace could almost hear the dust accumulating on her fingertip, the layers of centuries being bulldozed aside. "Fascinating dust," Benny said, voice not dissimilar to the Doctor's. She blew the dust from the end of her finger. Disturbed flecks sparkled in the beam of Ace's torch as they drifted to the floor. "Just dust," Ace shrugged. "How many times have I told you, Ace? There's no such thing as just dust." Benny adopted a light accent, startling the other woman with her uncanny vocal impersonation of the Time Lord. "Dust is fascinating, vibrant, and sexy. If you really want to find out how our civilization works, look in its dustbins. History is made in pigsties, not places. Why do you think we spend so much time in the seediest dumps in the universe?" "Tell me about the dust, Professor." Ace decided to play along. "Well," Bernice slurred, slipping out of Gallifreyan accent and into the familiar tones of a bored and boring school lecture. "Dust is interesting because it tells you a lot about the places in which it gathers. The dust here tells us that this place hasn't been cleaned for a few decades," Ace prompted. "Centuries," Benny smiled. She moved closer to the wall, pressing her hands against the brickwork. Intrigued, Ace crouched beside her, shining the beam of the torch onto the patch of wall Benny was examining. Bernice's palms ran over the surface of the wall, pressing fingertips against the textured brickwork and tapping at the crumbling mortar. "Seriously," Bernice said, after an oppressive minute's silence. "The architecture's a mess, chronologically speaking. This isn't really my field." "What do you mean?" Ace asked, with cautious interest. "Some of this is prehistoric, the 16th century. The patch of wall she pointed to was, as far as Ace was concerned, undistinguished. But there's obviously been a lot of alterations in, the 18th century, and they've been changing it almost continuously since then. This wall's unstable. It looks like they've been ripping out bits of it on a regular basis, replacing them with identical bits, of course." "Right," Ace nodded. "Why bother?" "Probably because if this wall comes down, it'll bring the rest of the house with it," Bernice said, carefully lifting her hands from the surface. "Mind you, I'm not an expert." "You don't like this place, do you?" Her voice became lower, huskier. "I can tell." Ace ignored the urge to shiver again, and nodded. "Not this place," she said. "Just old houses in general, empty rooms and passages. You think you can hear voices on the edge of your hearing, ghost voices scratching in the darkness behind the walls." She blinked, turned to make eye contact with her companion. "Just something from when I was a kid," she said. "A stupid thing. Did you ever have anything that scared you?" "I used to have nightmares about a 6-foot green spider wanting to eat my face while I was asleep," Benny replied lightly. "Then I discovered what sterile environment meant." She stopped, her face withering into a picture of embarrassment under Ace's steel glare. Ace smiled, and Bernice's guilty expression broke up. "I found a way out." The doctor stepped out of the darkness. Ace had shifted her body into a defensive posture before realizing who it was. Her composure recovered. She breathed heavily with relief. "Sorry, did I startle you?" he asked, radiating innocence. "Sorry," he repeated himself, with greater conviction. "Turned up anything?" Bernice asked, finding her breath. "A door. It's partially blocked, but we should be able to get through. The question is, do we venture forth like brave-hearted heroes, or lock ourselves in the TARDIS like honest cowards?" "We go," Ace was determined. "Be constructive. There was no point lurking in the TARDIS. Take the fight to the enemy." Benny nodded, saying nothing. The doctor glanced between them, studying their faces. Finally he nodded. "Once more unto the breach," he said, forcing a smile. "Follow me." The door was closer than Ace expected. It was little more than a rotting wooden frame set into a shallow cutting in the brickwork. There were some planks half-heartedly nailed across the doorway, but they were rickety and loose. The wood itself was brittle. The boards came away with minimal effort. Beyond the door was another uninspiring stretch of cellar. One plain brick passageway led off into the dark, and a smaller side passage, also brick, also terminated in darkness. It was cleaner here, less cluttered. The floor was bare, clear of abandoned furniture and dust. There was an atmosphere of care and attention to this place, which the other rooms lacked. The brickwork here seemed sturdier, less likely to crumble at the slightest touch. Glancing down the side passage, Ace saw that there had even been an attempt to disguise the nature of the walls behind a smooth plaster finish. The other rooms had been derelict, obviously undisturbed for years. Not here. Ace could believe that people actually worked here. The doctor agreed. He pointed his torch upwards so that the beam danced on the ceiling. Picked out in the light was a web of dangling wires connected to an exposed light bulb. The doctor cast the beam further down the passage, finding further bulbs set at regular intervals along its length. "The lights suggest that someone uses this place," he said. "Lives here, possibly." "Possibly?" Ace asked. "Looks industrial. Very heavy and intricate, without the need to disguise its functional nature. Hardly the norm in a domestic situation. Besides, how old is it? It's not proof of anything." "This is the bit where one of us suggests we split up and look around," Bernice said chirpily. There was something gleefully sadistic in her psychology that thrived in adversity, and the monster picks us off and eats us one by one. "Since you two are looking so grim, I think it's going to have to be me. I'll go this way," she said, pointing down the length of the main passageway. "You two try down the other way. Meet back here in 5-10 minutes. Scream if there's any trouble, yes?" There were nods, a brief exchange of torches. Then Bernice slipped into the darkness, and the doctor and Ace pulled into the side corridor, walking side by side and in silence. The passage ended sharply in a plain metal slab of a door. The beam of the doctor's torch flattened against its smooth surface, revealing that it had been painted an unappetizing shade of cabbage green. The paint was beginning to flake. The door was indented with a hand grip, but was otherwise unfriendly and impregnable. Ace stopped by the door and stared at it single-mindedly. "Ace, I'm sorry if I've seemed a bit brusque," the doctor said softly, close to her ear. "It's just I'm very worried about the TARDIS." Ace hummed an acknowledgement, but didn't look at him. She was preoccupied with the door. She dug her hand into the indentation and tugged. "Ace, you've shown me you can survive in a totally alien environment without the TARDIS to fall back on," the doctor continued, apparently oblivious to her efforts with the door. "In that respect, you're a better person than I am. I need the ship. I don't want to see it hurt, damaged." The door hadn't budged. Not an inch. It couldn't just be the weight. It had to be locked. "There's something in this place powerful enough to tear the TARDIS from the vortex. If that thing is malevolent, then imagine what it could do to you or to Benny. We're playing in the dark, gambling for our lives, with a hand we don't understand, against a dealer who's cheating. If I seem on edge, it's because I'm worried, terrified," he added. "You're not alone, Doctor. Perhaps I'm just naturally antagonistic," Ace muttered, tugging sharply at the door several times, failing even to make it rattle. "Why won't you open, you bastard?" she yelled, her frustration finally getting the better of her. "It opens inwards," the doctor hummed. Ace landed a vicious thump on the side of the door, and it opened silently. A vexed smile settled on her lips, a light blush on her cheeks. The room was as functional and bare as the rest of the building. Its walls were an insipid shade of grey-brown, occasionally enlivened by colourless scraps of wallpaper overlooked when the rest had been scraped away. The other rooms had been cold, but the chill was pronounced here. Briefly, Ace felt the sharp, icy brush against her skin before her combat suit reacted and grew warm. Though colder than the rest of the cellar, the room seemed lighter. It was dark, but not the enveloping blackness of the other rooms. It was half dark, the shadows robbed of their deeper levels. Ace glanced upwards and saw a light fitting dangling from the ceiling by a bare flex. There was no bulb. The room was unfurnished, almost. It was large, grey, and ugly. It squatted in the corner of the room, daring anyone to come near it. It was, simply, a wardrobe. It brushed the ceiling. It was almost as wide as it was high, its bulk magnified by the metal out of which it had been built. The doors were wooden, but these were only panels slotted into heavy metal frames. The box sat against the wall and brooded. Wardrobe was too weak a term for the sombre artifact. It was a sarcophagus. It had captured the doctor's interest. "Ace!" he called eagerly. "What do you make of this?" It was impressive, but Ace was unmoved by the doctor's enthusiasm. "Look at it," he said, the excitement in his voice suddenly replaced with a deep and resonant note of authority. Ace looked. "What for?" she asked. "Watch," the doctor commanded, seizing the handle on one of the doors. It came ajar gently after a slow tug, and, as it opened, it gained a halo. The light grew suddenly. It blazed from the newly formed crack between the doors, suffusing the gap, streaming into the room. It was sterile and powerful. Ace raised an arm to protect her face from the glare, but not artificial. It was a natural light, like a snatched glimpse of a sun at its zenith. The doctor slammed the door, hiding the light. Ace blinked frantically. Her eyes felt as if they were on fire, and a staple-shaped image lingered on her retina for more than a minute. She kept blinking, grateful for the coolness of the air. The doctor was talking. "It's light," he was saying. "Intense light. First in the TARDIS, now... Well, that couldn't have been artificial. There's no connection." "And what does that tell us?" Ace challenged him. "Nothing. I have suspicions." The doctor mused momentarily before adding, "No proof." He shrugged wearily and shook his head. Ace moved to the sarcophagus, slowly reaching out to touch the door. The doctor intercepted her quickly, seizing her by the wrist and shooting her a sharp glance. "No," he insisted. "Leave it." "Why?" "I want to know what it is before I go charging in," he told her. "And I want to find Benny first. We need to stick together." Dear Diary, I'm not writing this down. If I could, I'd be Mr. Tickle. So I'm going to have to memorize this, or paint it on the walls. Soon after she had left the doctor and Ace, Bernice found her surroundings changing. The brickwork and plaster of earlier sections gave way to walls lined with wooden panels. The barely concealed wiring of the light system disappeared into the ceiling. The dry dust taste at the start of the passage was replaced by the fragrance of old varnish blending with wood, echoes of a natural forest freshness. Only the atmosphere was unchanged, as trapped and oppressive as before. "I've been going for almost 10 minutes now," Bernice told herself with a soft whisper, and, tell the truth, Bernice Summerfield is lost. Not lost, she corrected herself, just disorientated. This house is like a maze without any options. No turn-offs, no junctions, no forked passages, no doors. A very easy maze, in fact. All I have to do is turn round and keep walking. But you wouldn't believe the number of twists and turns there'll be on the way back. The architecture's too complex for its own good. This is not the work of a sane man. Trust me. I'm turning back now. The Doctor and Ace are bound to have found something more substantial than corridors. Something more substantial will have found them. He'll be surrounded by a death squad led by a fascist whose pet hate is confident, charismatic, fast talkers. She'll be locked in a dungeon, about to be married off to and, or ritually sacrificed by a drug-crazed alien mastermind who doesn't know what he's letting himself in for. She closed her mental diary and turned, shining her torch down the corridor. She stared briefly, swore, and dropped the torch. The light went out to the sound of cracking plastic. She scrambled round for it in the darkness, finding it quickly, not surprised to find the lens smashed and the bulb badly damaged. The light was a dim spot glowing in the dark, the torch sizzling as it shone. She swore again, louder this time. "Hello again, diary," she said bitterly. "Have just vandalized the torch. It's giving off less light than something very dark indeed, and I get the feeling it's going to explode in my hand. I'm not bothered. I can get back, though. It'll just take a bit longer, and I'll be making nose contact with more than one wall on the way. It's just... She paused, trying to remember what she had seen, the brief glimpse down the passageway. She saw the passage behind her, spreading away in a straight line back to the door where she had left the doctor. She hadn't exaggerated the rambling nature of the corridor, the fiddly, confused turnings. So, if they suddenly weren't there anymore... What a terrible blow! The archaeological world has been robbed of the mind of its finest student, she said finally. No, it's nothing. A trick of the dark. She was talking louder now, trying to reassure herself. I'll find out soon enough. She edged forward through the darkness and collided with an oak-panelled wall. Her confidence flooded back. Her sanity was no longer in question. Casting round for the right direction, she saw the light. It was a thin strip of brilliance running along the ground where the floor met the wall. It didn't illuminate the passage, but it was there. It had to be a crack, a slight gap between the wall and the floor. And if there was light coming from it, Bernice reasoned, then there had to be something more than bricks, mortar and plaster finish behind it. Since she hadn't noticed a single door here before, there must be a hidden entrance concealed by the panels. She edged along the wall to the light, hands brushing against the panels in the vain hope of finding some sort of handle. A hidden door would have a concealed opening mechanism, and that would be hard to spot with a torch. She was on the verge of turning away when it occurred to her that there had been no light when she had gone past. She couldn't have failed to notice it. Therefore, it had been turned on recently after she had passed this section, which meant that there was someone in there. She considered heading back to find the doctor, but the light might be turned off in the meantime, and she would have no chance of finding it again. Besides, she'd never been reliant on the doctor to take the initiative. She rapped her knuckles against one of the panels. The wall swung open to an accompaniment of squealing hinges. Light filled the corridor from the open doorway. It framed a tall and handsome man, stooping slightly. Benny estimated that he was in his mid-20s, though something worn in his face suggested he was much older. The youthful spark in his eyes and the innocent smile wouldn't have looked out of place on a 3-year-old. His appearance careered towards the unkempt, enhanced by the uncombed mess of dark hair and about 2 days' worth of unchecked stubble. He was dressed plainly, in fading grey trousers and a baggy off-white shirt which, Benny noticed neutrally, was wrongly buttoned. He stared at her until she felt uncomfortable, then lost interest and began gazing distractedly round the passage. "Oh," he said eventually, "I've been expecting you, haven't I? Come in." It was an ordinary mug, decorated in blue and white stripes, cold and quite empty. Bernice could see a vague reflection of her face swimming on the smooth white surface at the bottom. Wondering what to do with it, she looked up and leant back in her wickerwork chair and smiled questioningly at her host. The man raised an identical mug to his lips and smiled back at her. "Drink up, Laura," he said. "It'll get cold." He smiled again, dangerously toothy this time. Bernice raised the hollow vessel to her mouth and pretended to sip. She glanced around, drinking in the simplicity of what was, for want of a better expression, her host's cell. It was a plain room, though not an uncomfortable one, decorated in a tasteful shade of pale pink. Most of the available floor space was consumed by furniture. A couple of chairs, a desk covered in writing materials and reams of much scrawled upon paper, a small bookcase sitting innocuously in one corner, straining under the weight of hundreds of books. There was even a wash basin built into one wall. The bed devoured most space, squashed into a corner. There was also, her host assured her blithely, a wardrobe hidden behind a couple of doors set flush in the wall. The other door was the one through which she had entered, equally well hidden on this side of the wall. Her host had been very secretive about its opening mechanism, and so, Benny realized, there was little chance of making a quick getaway. Though her host seemed charming and harmless, there was something about him which made her teeth itch. She couldn't pin down exactly what it was that disturbed her. Perhaps something in the way he moved? His body language was too loose, too smooth, lacking the stiff, jerky movements most people affected in social situations. He was too easily distracted. His eyes never focused, even in the middle of conversation. He had been expecting her, but knew nothing about her. There had been little things, but nothing tangible that she could latch onto, until he had started pouring non-existent tea from an imaginary pot. That was it. The man was a Fruit Loop. Benny grinned, pretending to enjoy the tea, finding it best to humour him until the doctor and Ace arrived, and she had numbers on her side. "My name isn't Laura," she pointed out. "It's Bernice." "Cranley," the man responded, grinning happily. "My name," he added, like a child trying to impress its parents with a newly learned scrap of knowledge. Benny nodded and made exaggerated gulping motions. Cranley was leaning forward towards her, not paying her much attention, but looking as if he was poised to spring if she made the wrong move. She resolved to be careful and moved lazily across the room to the bookcase, where she made a show of studying the titles on the spines. Elliot, Wuthering Heights, The Man in the Iron Mask, Coleridge. Any moment now, the Doctor and Ace would come down the passage looking for her, see the light, investigate. Northanger Abbey, The Prisoner of Zenda, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Condition of Muzak. She seemed to remember leaving the remains of the torch outside too. They couldn't ignore that. Lewis Carroll, the magician's nephew. Blake, Melmoth the Wanderer. She glanced at Cranley, and a chill coursed through her body when she saw that he was absently toying with her torch. She returned her gaze to the books. The Man Who Was Thursday, Foucault's Pendulum, The Dice Man. "They're left over from my days at university," Cranley pointed out proudly. "I did a couple for the degree." "Which university?" Bernice asked, running through the names on the spines. There was something reassuring about Cranley when he was talking, something unnerving about his silences. "Cambridge, Laura," he replied, "where we met." Suddenly Bernice preferred the silences. "My name is Bernice," she snapped. She fell silent, realizing that she could hear other voices, distant and muffled, but still distinct. The Doctor and Ace were calling her. Obviously they'd tired of waiting and had come searching. Their cries were hardly circumspect or inconspicuous. Benny found that oddly reassuring. "You have friends," Cranley said, cutting off Bernice's attempt to call back to them. He'd lost the cheerfulness and innocence. It was still a pleasant, even tone, but suddenly dangerous. His mouth twitched into a humorless smile. He rose and crossed to the light switch. The lights went out, plunging the room into gloom. "Perhaps they won't find you. Just because you can see a door doesn't mean that anyone else will, don't you think?" His loose movements were gone, swept away by a different set of dangerous, tense mannerisms. The new deep shadows of the room emphasized them. The stooped, almost hunched figure before her didn't seem entirely human anymore. "You're mad," she said simply. There was no point in adding anything else. Mad said it all. "I'm as sane as a hatter," Cranley protested. "You must be mad," Bernice pointed out, trying to sound relaxed, aware that it wasn't working. "If you think I'm not going to shout back." "Yes," Cranley said, more a gesture of the lips than a sound. Then, suddenly, he moved. He threw himself forward, far quicker than Bernice had expected. He lunged at her, throwing her back against the bookcase. Caught off balance in a shower of tumbling paperbacks, Bernice found herself pinned against the wall by Cranley's light bulk. He was a wiry man, and Bernice realized that a well-timed shove could send him sprawling. She almost managed it. Then he pressed the kitchen knife against her throat, and she decided to keep very still indeed. She had no idea where he had got the knife from, or when he had picked it up, but frankly she didn't care. The fact of the knife was enough for her. There was no pressure, it barely touched her skin, and that was reassuring. He wasn't really trying to kill her, he just wanted her to be quiet. He was a loony with a knife, but maybe he wasn't really a violent loony. Maybe he was a good loony. Maybe he could be humoured. No, the knife was there. It was brushing her skin, but it was enough. The thin sharpness of the blade against her neck was so light it tickled, but it might dig tighter at the slightest provocation. Cranley could kill her on the spot, given reason. He might not want to, but he could, and would. Bernice froze. Discretion was the better part of valor, and if she was really discreet, she might get out of it alive. She hoped. "There is a method by which the vocal cords of the subject may be severed without causing undue damage to the subject's person," Cranley continued, voice as bland as the presenter of an archaeological documentary. Bernice had fallen asleep to voices like that, although none of the commentators had Cranley's advantage. "This method is specialized. I am not a medical man, and if I attempt it, the result will probably be fatally messy. I don't want to make you dead. There are simpler methods of keeping you quiet. Understand?" Bernice understood. The doctor and Ace's shouts grew louder. Bernice closed her eyes and kept quiet, even when Ace yelled right outside the door. The volume of the cries gradually dropped away. Finally, there was silence. "Dear Diary, I'm up shit creek." "Well, now everything's hunky-dory," Cranley said, smiling like a toddler. The knife remained bristling at Benny's throat.